In a world where money can buy almost everything, one truth remains unshaken: life is fragile and beyond the grasp of wealth. This is the story of a billionaire's son who was given only 3 days to live. Doctors had lost hope, and even his father's billions couldn't buy him more time. But fate works in mysterious ways. A poor street kid with nothing but courage and kindness stepped into his life. What followed was a miracle no one could have imagined. The billionaire had always believed that his power and wealth could solve any problem. His son Arian was the heartbeat of his empire, the only heir to the fortune he had built from the ground up. But one evening, Arian collapsed suddenly, gasping for air, his body trembling with weakness. Within hours, doctors from the most advanced hospitals were flown in by private jets. They examined him with worried faces, whispering among themselves while the father stood frozen in fear. After endless tests and long hours, the truth came out: a rare illness that science had no cure for. Their voices trembled as they told the father, "He has only 3 days to live." Those words echoed like thunder in his ears. For the first time, his billions felt like dust, powerless against the certainty of death. The mansion, usually alive with laughter and lights, turned into a house of mourning. Reporters camped outside, broadcasting the tragedy across the world. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the sound of Arian's shallow breathing. The father clutched his son's frail hands, whispering promises he could not keep, begging the heavens for mercy. Every tick of the clock was unbearable, a reminder that time was slipping away. Arian looked at him with tired eyes and whispered, "Father, I don't want to die." Those words pierced deeper than any wound. The man who owned cities could do nothing for the one life that mattered most. That night, as the city lights glittered in the distance, despair filled every corner of the mansion. But far away, on the same streets where the billionaire's wealth cast its shadow, lived a boy with nothing, whose kindness and courage were about to rewrite the fate of the dying heir. Beneath the glittering towers and glass walls of the billionaire's empire lay another world, unseen and often forgotten. In that world lived Samir, a barefoot boy who had grown up on pavements and back alleys. His days were filled with hunger, his nights with the cold sting of loneliness. He sold flowers at traffic signals, carried bags for strangers, and sometimes shined shoes to earn just enough for a stale piece of bread. Yet, despite the harshness of the streets, Samir carried something precious inside him, a heart that refused to grow bitter. He found joy in the little things, like chasing birds by the riverbank or reading torn pages of books he pulled from trash cans. Knowledge fascinated him. Kindness defined him. When other children mocked him for being poor, he smiled and walked away. When he saw a starving dog, he shared his last meal without hesitation. He lived with nothing, but carried hope in abundance. The city barely noticed him, but Samir noticed everything. The loneliness in people's eyes, the struggles they hid behind fancy clothes, the fragile beauty of life itself. One evening, while sipping tea from a cracked cup at a roadside stall, he overheard a conversation that made him pause. "The billionaire's son has only 3 days left," a man whispered. Samir froze, his mind turning restless. He thought of the boy lying helpless in a mansion, and for some reason his heart ached. Though he was nobody, though the world never cared for him, he whispered to himself, "If only I could do something." In that moment, destiny began weaving threads between two souls who lived worlds apart. The next morning, Samir found himself drawn towards the grand hospital where Arian lay. Security guards in black suits stood like statues, their eyes sharp, their faces stern. Ordinary people were kept far away, but Samir was no ordinary boy. Quick and clever, he slipped past unnoticed, weaving through crowds with the ease of someone used to surviving invisibly. Inside the hospital, he was overwhelmed by the sight of polished floors, white walls, and the endless sound of machines beeping. He wandered through the corridors until at last he saw him. The boy on the news, the heir to billions, lying pale and fragile in his bed. For a moment, Samir just stood there staring at Aryan, whose breathing was slow, whose eyes seemed to carry the weight of goodbye. Their eyes met, and something unexplainable passed between them. Aryan blinked, surprised to see a stranger his age, dressed in torn clothes, standing by his door. "Who are you?" Aryan asked weakly. Samir smiled nervously. "No one, just someone who doesn't like to see another boy give up." Aryan's lips curved into the faintest smile, the first in days. For the next hour they talked. Samir spoke of the streets, of how he fought every day to survive. Aryan listened, fascinated by a life so different from his own. And when Samir promised, "You won't die." "Not while I'm here." Aryan's eyes filled with a fragile hope. That night, Samir left the hospital with a new mission carved into his soul. He didn't know how, but he was determined to save Aryan. Samir sat under the bridge where he often slept, staring at the stars that peeked through the city haze. The promise he had made to Aryan echoed in his mind. He had no money, no power, no knowledge of medicine, but he had something stronger: faith in impossible things. He recalled stories he had once read about ancient healers and forgotten remedies. Somewhere deep within him, a voice whispered that the answer existed, hidden far from hospitals and laboratories. "I will find it," Samir muttered to himself. The next morning, he returned to the hospital, sneaking inside once more. Aryan looked weaker than before, his breathing shallow. Samir took his hand and whispered, "I swear I'll come back with something that will save you." Aryan's eyes shone with a flicker of belief. Even the billionaire father, who noticed this strange boy visiting his son, remained silent, too broken to interfere. Samir left the city that very day, setting out on foot toward the distant countryside. He asked strangers, old healers, even monks in temples about cures for rare illnesses. Most shook their heads, some laughed, others dismissed him as a foolish child. But Samir kept moving, his promise burning inside him like fire. He wandered through villages, over hills, and into forests, following every faint clue. The city had forgotten about him, but in the silent struggle of a poor boy's footsteps, a miracle was quietly being chased. Days blurred together as Samir pushed himself beyond exhaustion, surviving on scraps and kindness from strangers. He reached a remote village where he heard whispers of an old healer who lived deep inside the forest. Locals spoke of him with reverence and fear, claiming he knew secrets of nature that modern doctors had long abandoned. Samir followed their directions, trekking through dense woods where sunlight barely reached the ground. His feet bled, his stomach growled, but he refused to stop. Finally, he stumbled upon a tiny hut surrounded by herbs and strange bottles hanging from the trees. An old man with piercing eyes stepped out, studying Samir carefully. "Why have you come, boy?" he asked in a voice like gravel. Samir fell to his knees, tears in his eyes, and explained everything. The billionaire's son, the 3 days, the promise he had made. The old man listened silently, his face unreadable. Then he disappeared into his hut and returned with a small pouch filled with dried herbs. "This plant," he said, "blooms only once every decade in the heart of the forest. It holds power, but it demands purity of intention. If your heart is true, it may save the boy. If not, it will do nothing." Samir clutched the pouch to his chest, his heart racing. For him, there was no doubt. His intention was clear. Thanking the healer, he turned back toward the city, knowing that time was running out. The boy who had nothing now carried in his hands the fragile hope of saving a billionaire's heir. Samir ran through the night with the precious pouch clutched tightly in his hands. The forest behind him seemed endless, and the road ahead stretched like a cruel test of his endurance. He thought of Arian, lying pale and breathless, and pushed himself harder. Every second felt like sand slipping from an hourglass. His body screamed for rest, but his promise carried him forward. As he neared the city, the streets glowed with neon lights. Cars rushed past, and life carried on as if nothing was wrong. Nobody noticed the ragged boy with torn clothes and bleeding feet racing against death itself. He stumbled, fell, and rose again, wiping sweat from his brow. By dawn, his legs trembled, but the hospital tower finally appeared in the distance. He staggered inside, ignoring the shocked faces of guards and nurses. Bursting into Aryan's room, he saw the boy barely conscious, his lips dry, his chest rising faintly. Samir cried out, "Hold on, Aryan, I found it." Doctors tried to stop him, but the billionaire raised his hand, his eyes wide with desperate curiosity. Samir poured the herbs into warm water and gently fed it to Aryan, whispering, "You promised me you'd fight." For a few terrifying moments, nothing happened. Aryan's body lay still, the machines around him beeping steadily. Silence filled the room until, suddenly, Aryan coughed weakly, his color returning ever so slightly. Gasps filled the room. For the first time in days, hope returned. Samir collapsed to the floor, exhausted, but smiling as though he had already won half the battle. Doctors surrounded Arian, baffled at what they were witnessing. His pulse grew stronger, his breathing steadier, as though a hidden energy was reviving him from within. They tested his vitals, shook their heads in disbelief, and whispered among themselves, "This is impossible," one muttered. But there, Arian was, no longer slipping toward death, his fragile life clinging with renewed strength. The billionaire stepped forward, his face pale with awe. He looked at Samir, this street boy covered in dirt and sweat, and for the first time in his life, the man bowed his head. Not to a king, not to money, but to a child's courage. "What did you give him?" the father asked, his voice trembling. Samir explained about the healer in the forest, about the herb that only bloomed once in a decade. About the test of intention. "It wasn't me," Samir said softly. "It was hope. Aryan wanted to live, and I wanted to keep my promise." Days passed, and Aryan's strength slowly returned. The boy who was told he had only 3 days to live was sitting up, smiling, even laughing. Reporters outside the mansion went wild when news spread. "Miracle heals billionaire's son." But inside those walls, the truth was simple. It wasn't science alone. It was faith, sacrifice, and the heart of a boy who refused to let another child die. Yet, even as the mansion celebrated, whispers of doubt grew. Was the cure permanent, or would death return to claim its debt? Not everyone celebrated Aryan's recovery. Hidden in the shadows were people who thrived on the billionaire's downfall. Enemies who had long waited for his empire to crumble saw the boy's survival as a threat to their schemes. One night, as Samir slept in the guest room the family had offered him, a man in a dark suit approached him. "You've done enough," the stranger hissed. "Leave now, and no harm will come to you." Samir stood tall despite his trembling heart. "I promised Arian I would not leave until he was safe," he replied. The man's eyes narrowed. By the next morning, Samir noticed suspicious faces watching him in the hallways, and rumors began to spread among the staff. Some called him a fraud, a street kid looking to take advantage of the billionaire's pain. Arian's father, torn between gratitude and fear of betrayal, struggled with doubt. But Arian himself clung to Samir's hand, whispering, "Don't leave me. You're my only friend." The mansion, once filled with joy, became a place of tension. Guards argued, doctors questioned the herb, and shadows of greed crept closer. Samir, though just a boy, stood firm against it all. He wasn't fighting only for Aryan's life anymore. He was fighting against a world that couldn't believe miracles could come from someone with nothing. The weight was heavy, the threats real, but the promise in his heart burned brighter than fear. For a while, Aryan's recovery seemed steady, but then came a night that shook everyone. Aryan suddenly collapsed again, his body trembling, his breath fading as doctors rushed to his side. Panic filled the mansion as alarms echoed through the halls. The billionaire froze, fear gripping him like icy chains. Had the miracle failed? Was the cure only temporary? Samir pushed through the chaos, his heart racing. He begged the doctors not to give up, but they shook their heads. "His body is rejecting the cure," one whispered. Samir refused to believe it. He knelt beside Aryan's bed, tears streaming down his dirty cheeks, and whispered, "Don't go, Aryan. Please don't go. You promised me you'd fight." Aryan's eyelids fluttered, but his pulse weakened with each passing second. The billionaire fell to his knees, crying out to a god he had long forgotten. For the first time in years, he admitted he was powerless. Minutes passed like hours, and silence hung heavy in the air. Samir held Aryan's hand tightly, refusing to let go. Suddenly, a faint smile appeared on Aryan's lips. He whispered weakly, "I'm still here because of you." The doctors, stunned, checked his vitals again. Against all odds, his pulse stabilized. The herbs had not failed. It was Aryan's own spirit, fueled by Samir's faith, that carried him back from the edge. Hope returned, fragile but alive. For everyone else, it was a miracle, but for Samir, it was simply the power of not giving up. The next morning, sunlight poured through the mansion windows, golden and warm, as if the universe itself was celebrating. Aryan sat up in bed, his cheeks full of color, his eyes alive with energy. Doctors ran test after test, and the results left them speechless. There was no trace of illness left in his body. The boy who was meant to die in 3 days now stood at the doorway of a new life. The billionaire embraced his son with tears of joy, but then his gaze fell on Samir, standing quietly in the corner. For a moment, the man was lost for words. Finally, he walked over, knelt down, and hugged the street boy tightly. "You gave me back my son," he whispered. "And no wealth in this world can repay that." News of the miracle spread across the globe, but the true story was known only to those within those walls. A poor boy with nothing had achieved what doctors and money could not. Samir was no longer just a nameless child from the streets. He became family, a brother to Aryan, and a son in the eyes of the billionaire. But most importantly, he remained who he always was, a boy with a heart full of kindness. The miracle didn't just save Aryan's life. It changed the billionaire's soul, teaching him that real wealth lies not in money, but in love, hope, and compassion. And for Samir, it proved that even someone with nothing can do the impossible. Life often teaches us that money can build empires, buy luxuries, and command respect. But it cannot guarantee the things that truly matter: love, loyalty, and the gift of life itself. The billionaire who once believed wealth could conquer anything discovered that salvation came not from his fortune, but from the courage of a boy who owned nothing but a pure heart. Samir proved that kindness and determination have a power greater than gold, a strength that can even challenge death itself. True miracles are not born from wealth or status, but from selfless acts and the will to fight for others. This story reminds us that no one is too small to make a difference, no heart too poor to give hope, and no promise too impossible to keep. The greatest treasure we can ever hold is compassion. For in the end, it is not riches that save lives, it is love that saves lives. Thank you for treading this trail of tales till we travel together again on another adventure.